My friends, welcome. The mainstream media is now confirming that we are entering a totally different kind of future. It is the end of the world as we know it, not in a crazy doom and gloom, everything's exploding sense, but in an objectively true, things are going to change and never be the same sense. And they are telegraphing that we're going to be encountering energy lockdowns or climate lockdowns, if you prefer, food rationing, a drastic reduction in industrial activity, and all of these things happening quite rapidly. We are entering, in short, exactly the future they told us that we'd be entering throughout all of the agendas that were published, including the absolute zero one that we talked about now 6 or 7 years ago, where we would be encountering a rapid reduction in the supply and use of all fossil fuels. That's happening now, and they needed a war to do it. They squeezed COVID about as hard as they could and got all that mileage out of it, but to get the rest of these policies and changes through, they needed a conflict, and now we're watching that. And that's what's happened over the last week as the energy infrastructure was destroyed across the Middle East, especially these LNG plants in Qatar, the Ras Laffan site being blown up, being 17% of Qatar's LNG production. Financial Times describes it as an Armageddon scenario, which I don't think is a coincidence, given that we have this crazed death cult that is trying to hypnotize the eschaton. They're trying to force the return of the Messiah by creating all of these prophecies. We will talk about that later. For now, let's look at what the media is actually telling us here from the Daily Mail. Food rationing, panic buying, planes grounded, and an economic hammer blow far worse than COVID. Economists explain the nightmare scenario that could be just weeks away due to the war. Blame it on the war if the situation doesn't change. Some countries may be unable to secure energy to meet demand, and that would trigger a domino effect across the economy, hitting everything from air travel to food production. This would be true across Europe, the UK, and large parts of Asia. Especially, energy costs would be spiraling and industries would be forced to cut back. Got some charts, and then down here, if that strait remains closed, you'll have plants without feedstock and we'll get real rationing. We may need to ground planes, shut chemical plants, and accept lower crop yields. Less food, higher food prices. Parts of the world won't be able to afford it. He added that most of the global economy is underpinned by oil and gas, and so this is not about just pushing up prices, but it would quickly disrupt transport networks and manufacturing, and yes, agriculture. So rather than go through all of the individual data points, which are staggering, right? Like I said, the Qatar's LNG has been largely shut down. All of the helium and the polymers and all we've talked already about the fertilizer, with a third of it going through the Strait of Hormuz and another third of it being export from China, who stopped their exports, right? We could look at all these data points, almost each of which in itself is catastrophic and, to be fair, alarming. But I think you get it. I think we all understand that we are witnessing the deliberate destruction of the still beating heart of the global economy, and it will have immense effects on the way we live our lives, and that's all by design. So Australia already is warning that they'll have to, this is why they're talking about shutting down air traffic, because Australia sources their jet fuel from China, and China has stopped exporting it. And then today also the IEA made some recommendations, these 10 recommendations, which sound very similar to the lockdown, to the rising vibes of climate lockdowns and energy lockdowns. We'll read here from The Guardian. The world's energy watchdog has advised governments to reduce highway speeds and encouraged people to carpool, or even better, work from home, to combat the soaring oil prices and impending fuel shortages caused by the conflict. Blame it on the war. It is time to take emergency measures, whether you're in the UK or the US or Australia, which are the member countries of the IEA, to curb oil demand. Let's zoom down to their 10 recommendations. Work from home where possible. Reduce the highway speed limits. Encourage public transport. Limit car access to roads in large cities through a number plate rotation scheme. So basically rationing access to driving. right? That would be a prelude to actually removing private ownership of cars completely. In fact, number 5, increase car sharing. 6, encourage efficient driving for commercial vehicles. 7, divert LPG use from transport so you can use it for cooking. 8, avoid air traffic where possible. Encouraging electric cooking and other options to reduce reliance on LPG, and helping industries switch away from gas to other feedstocks. These measures have been issued at a time of growing concern that the U.S. does not have a clean exit strategy from the conflict. So it is because of Trump, and that also was part of the plan. Lest we forget that the World Economic Forum had openly talked about how it would probably be some crazy nationalist leader that would be the one that was responsible for causing the inevitable fall off of the cliff of the world economy. They want to point at Trump and laugh and say, look at that. We literally, look at all this chaos that nationalism caused. We can never tolerate this again. We must have global governance, because now global problems require global solutions. We can't tolerate another Trump or another nationalist anywhere ever again. Reinforces that Trump is actively already being blamed for having created the situation around the world, and that is the script. Remember, that was the plan, was to blame the nationalist and say never again. It was also the plan, ultimately, we heard from folks at the World Economic Forum, including Yuval Harari, to say we can't even afford to have human leaders anymore. Humans are too emotional, too capricious. We must replace them summarily with artificial intelligence, this ultimate wise AI god that will govern us better. So those were the high points of the plan. Now, digging into the agenda itself, yes, agriculture was all over the place. They wanted to switch to the indoor vertical farming, controlled by the technocrats. The World Economic Forum has long been talking about that and the fake meat, the self-fertilizing crops, because this is from 2021. They have long discussed why they wanted to remove nitrogen fertilizers, and what better way to do it than closing the strait and removing the liquid natural gas that is responsible for that Haber process for the creating of nitrogen fertilizers, of urea. So yes, and I wanted to pull up the Absolute Zero report. I did a video report on this many years ago, but just as a way of reminding us, they had this nice little timeline of how we could eliminate the decarbonization timeline with a number of different industries and vectors that would be affected by the decarbonization agenda. And as we look at the events of today and the media screaming, holy crap, we're going to have to X, Y, Z, all of X, Y, and Z and so forth are on the list for years now of the changes that the technocrats have wanted to make, because each secures tighter control over the population. This is not an organic response to a accidental energy crisis created by some crazy nationalist, that this is all scripted. And lest you still have any doubts about that, please remember that during the COVID, all of these countries in lockstep, so to speak, went through that same process. They all implemented the social distancing and the lockdowns, and all of those things were happening in synchronization across the countries, which now apparently are supposed to be enemies, right? Just on the surface, that's just the show. That's just the puppets fighting over here while they implement the agenda down here. It blows my mind that people are still distracted by the sophistry at that level. All right, so let's look again briefly at some of these points from Absolute Zero, because we can now see them happening at a breakneck speed. Road vehicles should be eliminated. Anything that depends on oil and gas, any new vehicles introduced from now on must be compatible with Absolute Zero, meaning no more fossil fuels. So obviously, if it's going to be electric cars, if there's no more oil, rail will be what takes place, because flying will be eliminated. All the smaller airports, other than the major ones, will be shut down. Domestic flight will pretty much be eliminated, because you should take a train anyway. And by 2030, they say that only the bigger hubs will be open. But by 2049, that's when all remaining airports close. Shipping. There are currently no freight ships operating without emissions, so that's got to go. We've got to get rid of that. And yes, by 2049, again, all shipping declines to zero. Again, you can go down this list, check out the older video. I don't want to go through all of these because I did that already in the old video, but they're now being executed in real time. And yeah, this is going to make decisively a change in the way we experience life. Then there were countries that literally had folks driving around using an IR thermometer to see if your house was heated more than a degree, too hot. If you were heating more than you were supposed to, then they would check your windows and say, hey, you're going to be, issued a citation for spending too much energy on heating your house or your apartment. So I just wanted to, rather than, everyone's still looking at the immediate data points right now, and I wanted to make sure we tied this back to the long-standing agendas that we've been talking about and anticipating. And now we're seeing, they're telling us that food rationing is coming in. I'm sure they will bring in, as I've been saying for some time, the digital IDs needed to implement that food rationing. Hang on, folks. It's going to get pretty wild. So the crazy bastards actually did it. They're really going for it. They're really going to go into energy lockdowns and full control over this kind of stuff. And it shouldn't be a surprise. It's still kind of, because they told us they were going to, it's still just kind of surreal because the scale of destruction and the complete upheaving of civilization and yes, the death and starvation that will result from these actions is incomprehensible. But let us just hope that people have heeded the warnings that you and I have been issuing for a decade now, and that they've started taking steps to prepare themselves. And if they hadn't yet, or if you had fallen into prep fatigue, now would be a very good time to wake back up and build a system that can be taking you through these times. My friends, welcome. The energy austerity movement is gaining steam rapidly this week as countries around the world take strikingly similar steps to manage their energy crises and fuel shortages. This does not at all look like a bottom-up situation where sovereign nations are taking steps independently to manage their resources. Rather, it looks like a top-down driven agenda that is being implemented as countries fall in lockstep with the agenda. In other words, what we're seeing right now is 2 weeks to flatten the fuel curve. It looks a lot like the coronavirus response did when all of these countries around the world did the exact same thing at the exact same time. So I want to step through some of those things today, particularly noting the digital ID that's now being used in Sri Lanka and that's attempting to roll out in Mexico right now for fuel rationing, because that definitely presages the use of digital IDs for rationing food as well as this crisis carries over into that area. So let's talk about it. All right, let's start with Sri Lanka, which, yes, has implemented a 4-day work week, but more notably, as I said, they're implementing a QR code-based system to ration fuel. That means that you can't get your liters at one gas station and then go wait in line at a different gas station to circumvent your rationing. Everything is being tracked digitally. Here from thehindu.com, a move authorities described as a precautionary measure amid the persisting uncertainty. This requires consumers to register and download a QR code that is specific to their vehicle for use at fuel stations. Those weekly quotas for cars and motorbikes are 15 liters and 5 liters respectively. Now, this alone should give us pause and make us wonder if this energy crisis is being used as a carte blanche to accomplish whatever the technocrats have been telling us they want to accomplish for some time now. This is the digital ID going live because we have to ration our fuel. A similar scheme is being launched in Mexico. Here from Mexico News Daily. Claudia Scheinbaum said on Thursday that cash payments at gas stations and highway toll booths will be eliminated starting this year. The administration is working with the banking sector to standardize digital payment procedures and facilitate digital payments for all Mexicans. I had just mentioned in a report last week that the UK was moving ahead with their Brit card and that the EU was mandating the member nations offer to their citizens an EU digital ID wallet. that would be used for tracking fuel purchases or food purchases or any number of things. So there's a reason the deadlines for all of this rollout is now, is 2026, is this year. All right, so now let's step through some of these countries and look quickly. Starting in Bangladesh, authorities have shut down all state and private universities nationwide. They've also started rationing fuel at the pumps, using armed guards to do that. They're implementing rolling blackouts, and severe gas shortages have forced Bangladesh also to halt operations at 4 out of their 5 state-owned fertilizer factories, which feeds into the fertilizer shortages and the way that this energy crisis is going to become a food crisis. Vietnam is actually also accelerating their switch to ethanol blended gasoline. So we're headed into food shortages. Let's just go ahead and burn some of our corn in our engines to help out with the price of gas. Completely insane. They're also including incentives for the production and use of electric vehicles and calling for the expanded development and use of renewable energy. They're also eliminating the use of the 20-watt and 60-watt incandescent light bulbs. Let's keep moving. Thailand, starting from today, civil servants will be working from home. The country has 95 days of energy reserves left. Watch, that's going to be used as the barometer for how bad the rationing and these measures need to get. It's just like when we watched the infection rate a few years ago and, oh, it's up, we got to lock you down harder. The government is also introducing energy conserving, this is still in Thailand, measures such as setting building air conditioning temperatures no cooler than 26 to 27 degrees Celsius. I told you, they're going to be running around looking to see if you're cooling your building or heating your home more than you're supposed to, and then keeping an eye on that. Thailand is also halting all of their energy exports other than Laos and Myanmar, and the government will also be asking the public to cooperate. Right now, it's an ask, but, quote, if the situation escalates, the government may consider mandatory measures, including dimming your signs at night and closing gas stations at 10 p.m. So look for curfews in the near future. In fact, there was just an article in New York City about how they need to shut the city down. The city that never sleeps will soon be turning off its lights at night to save energy. Okay, Myanmar has introduced a sweeping fuel rationing system for private vehicles starting Wednesday. Under a new even-odd licensing scheme, even-numbered plates will be able to drive on even dates, and odd-numbered plates can drive on odd days. This is an incredibly frustrating system for people in a city like Yangon, where we depend so heavily on cars, said one resident. But never mind that, you'll get used to it. Enjoy your lockdowns. Don't worry, it's only 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Myanmar is also limiting the amount of gas you can buy. Motorcyclists are allowed only to buy $1.25 worth of gas, while motorists could spend no more than $2.50. Pakistan as well is closing all of their universities in a series of energy austerity measures is what they're calling it. The Prime Minister announced that all schools across Pakistan will remain closed for just 2 weeks. Universities and other higher education institutions have been instructed to immediately shift to online classes. Government employees will also be working remotely, and they will be operating on a shortened schedule, another 4-day work week. I told you, there's similarities across these countries. Somehow they're all doing the same thing. Philippines also adopting a 4-day work week and also announcing that they're going to amend their Biofuels Act of 2006 in order to accelerate the deployment of bioethanol. Again, let's just burn more food. We don't have enough oil, burn the corn. My friends, welcome. Emergency energy austerity measures are spreading rapidly across Europe right now. Things are moving quite quickly, and even as Slovenia just an hour ago instituted limits on the amount of fuel that individuals can purchase, we're getting reports from barge captains and other folks in logistics and on the ground saying that they're not being allowed to deliver fuels onto the continent. So someone is deliberately withholding energy supplies even as they scream about the shortages and, hey, we need to institute emergency measures and take control over all these things. The plans that are being enacted are drafted years ago by the very groups within these governments that were tasked with the green energy transition. We'll take a look at some of these. They are literally the decarbonization groups, the climate change working groups. It is their plans that are now, and even they are in charge of the implementation of these plans in response to this energy crisis. And of course, this had to happen. It's not a surprise that the climate change people had to do something to keep their agenda running. As No Tricks Zone reported recently, there's just no support for climate change anymore. People are no longer afraid of global warming. They have bigger problems right now. And so when faced with that reality, with that lack of public support, they had to cause a crisis, and that's what we're witnessing now. The UN climate chief just the other day, in fact, said, hey, this Iran war, it's going to be great. It's going to cause us to get off, finally, these fossil fuels. All this stuff we've been trying to do for years and couldn't get the public to support. Now we're going to shove it down your throats. So in Brussels, the disruption to energy markets caused by the war is a lesson for you on the risks of relying on fossil fuels, which should drive governments to wean their economies off oil and gas faster, according to the UN Climate Secretary. Quote, if ever there is a moment to accelerate the energy transition and break your dependencies, this is that time. This is pretty much an admission that what's going on right now absolutely serves their goals. And it is a Dutch barge captain who has tweeted out quite critically saying, how are there fuel shortages? Here I am, I loaded up on biogas just a few days ago, coming from Amsterdam, and then we sat here for 10 days waiting to unload. Then we got redirected to a new destination. We got there last Wednesday, and now we've been sitting there and not unloading our product. How are you driving up the price of biodiesel even higher? By not allowing deliveries onto the continent. And, he continues, we are not the only ones stuck here, as storage for nearly a fortnight. That would be 20 days. But they're not being allowed to unload, even as you're not allowed to buy more fuel, right? Are you seeing what's happening here? It looks pretty clear. And so too does the situation in Australia. I had mentioned about a week ago when ABC News was talking about the fuel shortages and rationing that was going on in West Australia and New South Wales. There was one report that had a very telling interview with this gentleman, the local manager of a bulk fuel supplier. So this is the guy that sells gas to the gas stations, and he was directed to only deliver 50% of what the gas stations had actually requested, which basically ensures that there will be shortages, right? Naturally, what will happen is that they're going to run out of gas, and that is exactly why the premier, Chris Minns, then got on TV and said, "Oh man, looks like we're running out of gas." Right? It's so clear as the nose on my face that this is being engineered in order to implement the rationing, and Europe not even allowing those deliveries. It is abundantly clear that this is an engineered situation, a scripted crisis created in order to roll out the technocratic control over energy usage, the decarbonization, the deindustrialization, the total control. All right, let's now talk about the countries and the measures they're taking. We already mentioned that Slovenia is limiting, starting today, fuel purchases. Greece put price caps on food and energy prices. The Hungary as well, the Orban administration capped the liter of fuel, and that price-capped fuel can only be sold to vehicles with Hungarian license plates. France also implementing price caps. Slovakia is setting higher diesel prices for foreigners and keeping prices lower for their own citizens, but they're also limiting how much their citizens are allowed to use. Portugal has also put price caps on the energy prices there. And then, of course, these price limits this is important, would be accompanied by energy efficiency measures such as requiring households to cut consumption to 80% of last year's levels. So you have to eliminate 20%. You have to drop 1/5 of whatever it is you do at home. Gotta stop. In Denmark, meanwhile, they're literally begging, please, please, please stop driving, and citing, if you can stop driving, that will help stretch our reserves so that they last longer. Remember, I said yesterday, the energy reserves that these countries are citing will be used as the throttle for how much they clamp down on people's rights and how far these lockdowns going. In the UK, they're talking about lowering speed limits, just as the IEA had recommended only a few days ago. As they had recommended only a few days ago. The UK also is telling pubs that they should stop their refrigerators at night. And I surfaced this report out of the UK, which is called the National Emergency Plan for Fuel. It's produced by none other than the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So it literally is the same people who were doing climate change 20 years ago and authoring these plans who are now executing these agendas and in charge of doing it. It's also worth calling out, and bear in mind, this is a 2024 report that the UK has, so for years, has been planning, if they need to control supply and demand, these would be activated in the event of a severe national fuel supply shortage, like the one that is happening right now, that they'll be prioritizing emergency services and public transport, leaving households and companies out to dry. And then even they call out explicitly, they'll be rationing, restricting the sale of road fuels at retail filling stations, and even limiting the hours in which road fuels can be sold. So it's been baked into their plans. And some of the effects of that are already becoming apparent. Here from the Mountaineer, we're seeing that entire fleets of fishermen in Thailand are just no longer fishing because they can't get diesel fuel for their boats. So it's not just the farms aspect of food production that's affected by this energy crisis. It's the fishing. Energy is in everything, right? It's everything. This is why this is necessarily going to translate into a food crisis, which they will use to tighten their control even further. My friends, welcome. The energy crisis we're watching unfold right now doesn't stop with fuel rationing and energy lockdowns. It extends also to a total takeover of the food system, and the effects are already hitting food production. We've talked about fertilizer plants shutting down and obviously tractors using diesel, but that's just the beginning. There are also entire fleets of fishermen in Thailand and Ireland that are tying up their boats at the docks because they can't afford the price of diesel. Half of the world's crops are grown on land that requires irrigation, much of which is powered by diesel fuel. From the grain drying to the cold storage to the refrigerated transport, all of this is hungry for energy and is targeted for massive takeovers, even as the technocrats pour billions of dollars into fake meat, lab-grown synthetic proteins, and cell-cultured nonsense. We need to talk about this. And we'll start with the Irish Examiner, who says that the Ireland's offshore and inshore fleets could be grounded in 3 weeks if the government does not subsidize the fishing industry's fuel bill. This would lead to a shortage of fish. Industry reps are warning the viability of the entire Irish fishing industry is now in doubt. Diesel supplies over a certain amount have already started being limited in some ports. And Ireland is not alone in this. This is happening in Thailand as well, where we read here that hundreds of other fishers in Thailand have tied up their boats at the dock because of the surging price of diesel as the war in the Middle East disrupts global supply. Thailand and Ireland are not alone in this. In Spain, where they have more resources to deal with it, they passed a €25 million package to help to aid the fishermen with the price of diesel, although we quickly read down here that there are already questions about whether or not the scale of support matches the financial strain. In other words, it's not enough. And across the EU, there are calls to help support the fishermen who can't afford the fuel. If they don't, there will be no fish. This, of course, was anticipated by the technocrats who, as I said, have for years been investing tons of money into all of the fake meat, lab-grown nonsense because they knew those investments didn't make sense 10 years ago when Bill Gates and Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos and all these other billionaires, as well as Cargill, who's a World Economic Forum partner, were pouring billions of dollars into these ag tech companies. It didn't really make rational sense because it just didn't cost as much to raise a cow on pasture as it did for all this ridiculous technology and gene editing and 3D printing the proteins and the fats. But it did make sense to them because they are the authors of this plan. They have created this crisis, and it is they who stand not only to remove from us our ability to grow our own food and raise our own animals, but they're going to make a killing while they do it. In fact, Bill Gates even said that.
Although the artificial meat companies I put money into, I'm going to make more from those than I lost in the other ones.
But the World Economic Forum has been key in incentivizing governments to look at what Israel is doing and funnel investment into these food tech innovations because they knew what was coming. They knew that was how they would achieve total control over food. As I said, we can read here about irrigation from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, the FAO, that in 2023, this is a striking figure, 48% of all crops by value were created on land that requires irrigation. So again, those irrigation systems often, there's a ton of energy required for that water pumping, and a lot of those are powered directly by diesel. So as the price of diesel goes up, it becomes economically unviable to irrigate that cropland. And this is going to cause very real effects on food production and food availability. This is why, again, the World Economic Forum knew this was coming. They have positioned themselves to use digital technologies, including drones and AI, to survey the land and detect, using optical sensors, where the water needs to be deployed. That allows them to then say, if you don't use smart watering systems, then you're not allowed to water. And we've already seen they don't have a problem doing that. When there were droughts in California, they simply said, you're not allowed to water your lawn anymore. We've seen this actually in a few different parts of the world. So as water becomes at a premium and energy is hitting this crisis, they'll demand that you have smart watering systems, and that means that homesteaders or small farms that don't operate at a scale sufficient to be able to afford that kind of digital smart farming solutions will not be allowed to operate. Grain drying is another area of agriculture that's incredibly energy hungry. After you harvest wheat and other grains, you've got to dry them out so that they don't get all moldy, right? This is something also the World Economic Forum has had their eye on. Here from their paper, Improving Traceability in the Food Value Chain, we can read that smart grain drying silos are a part of the Internet of Things, real-time supply chain traceability and transparency systems. So energy is being used, and it always has been. This is now a mutant form of the global warming agenda that's being used to usher in these systems. They've been investing in and developing and testing the blockchain, supply chain, and the tokenized everything. And now, in order to roll it out, they've got this perfect crisis where they say, we've got to have the smart irrigation. We've got to have the smart grain drying because we just don't have enough energy to go around. So this is the crisis on the back of which all of these technologies are going to be rolled out, because that way they'll be able to track we know I've covered extensively in the past, they'll be able to track every resource on the planet and dictate to whom it is allowed to be shared. Somehow, though, we don't get any cuts to the ridiculous AI data centers, the energy-hungry behemoths that are being deployed. And they are not concerned at all with the tremendous amount of energy that's required for the cold storage of crops. In fact, the World Economic Forum is saying that we need to power more cold storage of food that will end food waste. We shouldn't allow small farmers and small homesteaders to be able to grow food because they don't have cold storage, and that means there's more food waste. They actually also mentioned that cold storage requirements are growing because of the requirements of mRNA vaccines, and I don't expect to see that or the AI data centers on the chopping block anytime soon. But we're not supposed to think about that. We're just supposed to feel the pain of the fuel rationing and then allow them to take over food systems. So the hypocrisy is staggering. And there's actually, I want to go back to Thailand because there's something else that's quite important here. And that is the human element of this. You know, there are generational fishermen, generational farmers who going back hundreds of years have done these things. One of the gentlemen that's mentioned from Thailand says, my grandfather was a fisherman before me. My father and I raised me on it. I now take my son out on the boat, but now we can't. For 3 weeks, I've been tied up because Even if I went out and caught fish, I'd spend more than what I made on the fish just for the diesel. So there are entire traditions and lineages that are ending. And moreover, food it's an intimate part of what makes us human. It's part of our connection with the earth and with the animals we raise. And to sever that and replace it wholesale with lab-grown meat and indoor vertical farming, it's not just gross, it's wrong. It was also mentioned in this article that there are carryover effects. It's not just ending with the fishermen. There are then dock workers who are responsible for unloading the fish and taking them to the market. And then there's the fishmonger who cuts it up and has the sales to people. There's an entire economy built around these systems, and all of that's going to be lost and replaced with the AI and the robotics. This is a big deal, and I think we need to talk about that. And I'm glad people are talking about fertilizer right now. We are heading from this energy crisis into a food crisis. And so the more of us are aware of that, the better we can weather that storm. But I want to make more of this clear to people. So thank you for helping me spread the word about this. But the more of us that are aware of what's going on and that this is a bid for total technocratic control of food and who can have access to that food, the better. And the more of us will be inspired to then go create community gardens or stock ponds with fish so that we can have local, community-driven access to food. And that's the real solution here. It's not more centralized control, more digital control gulags. It's local, it's community-based, it's regenerative. That's the future that you and I need to be building right now. So thank you for helping me get the word out there. We'll leave it there for today. If you value this data, please do help me keep it running. You can do that by subscribing for free or with some support at unshadowed.org, and you can find me at patreon.com/iceagefarmer. For now, thanks for watching and be well.